It's lovely to see you all and hope you're all keeping well. I'm Rachel, for those of you that don't know. I am the Graduate Forum Chair. So I just want to welcome you all to this session, the first of our research seminars on the theme of sustainable futures. Thank you very much to our presenters who are sharing their research with us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentations, and also thanks to our discussants who have agreed to help stimulate the debate and discussion afterwards. I'm really looking forward to your contributions as well. So thanks very much for coming. I hope you have a really good session and look forward to hearing all of your thoughts and ideas. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Olga. She's going to be the chair of further discussion. So again, thank you, Olga, for doing that.
Hello, also from my side, and thank you for your readiness to be the first ones in our series. So as I already mentioned in my emails, we will have a presentation first and then followed by discussion from the discussant first will follow, and the floor will be open for the whole discussion after the discussant's comments. And we will start, we have a very big mix of presentations today thematically from different points of view and different geographical regions. And we will start with Eva Saeva talking about cybersecurity in the European Union and COVID-19 crisis. So, floor or the Zoom is yours, Eva.
Hi everyone. Yeah, everybody can hear me, I suppose, I hope. Yeah, first of all, apologize for the computer issue. It's always fun when I have computer issues and I talk about cybersecurity. Yeah. Anyway, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Olga and Rachel and everybody else, and Emma and everybody else who organised this. And obviously, thank you, Helena, for going to be my discussant today. Much appreciated. I've always enjoyed UACES events. I try to attend everything, but you know, sometimes time-wise, that's not possible. So I'm quite enjoying the virtual organization of events lately because I can attend so many of them. But anyway, that's sort of my tiny introduction. So let me share my screen so you can have a look at my slides. So can you see the blue presentation? I heard it. Yeah, very good. Actually, I'm not going to put it on full screen because I kind of like reading my next slide, or my next slide says. So if you don't mind, I'm going to keep this format of the
Eva, if you want
PowerPoint. Yes.
There is a function called presenter view. If you go to your CZECH tab on the top, presentazione, I reckon you have an Italian Windows system on here. Then you have presenter view, which would give us the chance to see full screen, but gives you the chance to see the next slide and your notes.
Let's see. So is it somewhere here?
It's on the top one. You see File, Home, and then the sixth tab is Presentazione.
What do you say, Presentazione?
The top menu.
In the grey up at the top underneath the file name.
Can't see it. What do you see?
Never mind. It's perfect like this. I can read everything. All good.
I'm sorry about this. I can't see where this is sort of like stage fright now.
Okay.
Anyway, bear with me. I mean, my slides are very schematic anyway. They're just, you know, just for you to look at some things. So you're not going to miss on anything massively relevant. Or you can actually do it a bit like this, I suppose. No, we can't. Anyway, let's start. So if you're interested later, you can, there you go. I can share my slides with you. Okay, so let's start. Hi everyone, my name is Eva, for those of you who didn't understand that already. So I'm a second year PhD student at Newcastle Law School. So this is going to be purely legal research. But whatever comments from whatever fields you come from, they're very much welcome. So I look forward to your feedback and to your comments, because I've always found it beneficial hearing other certain fields feedback. So I'm going to talk about cybersecurity and the European Union and the lessons we've learned from the COVID-19 crisis. I know you've been hearing COVID everywhere, so bear with me today, 15 more minutes of that, and then probably, yeah, done for today. So my presentation, I know that when I say cybersecurity, each and every one of you understands completely different things. So let me briefly tell you what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to start with the legal framework, the EU legal framework and how it applies to cyber attacks. And what I mean by cyber attacks in this particular case, in this particular study, I mean state-sponsored attacks on critical infrastructure sectors. For example, the health sector. The EU has identified 7 critical infrastructure sectors with its NIS directive that I'm going to talk about more in detail in a second. And the health sector is one of these 7 critical infrastructure sectors. And I'm going to talk about how this sector was affected by the pandemic. Then I'm going to conclude with the key takeaways on the legal preparedness of the EU and the way the EU acts or has acted or is going to act in times of crisis. Since we're talking about sustainable futures, I believe this pandemic has shown us loads of gaps, let's put it like this, of well, a lot of the let's say legislative measures, specifically in cybersecurity, that the EU has adopted. So when I say legal framework, the legal framework today is based on the EU strategy of 2013, which identified 3 key pillars. These are law enforcement, network and information security, which is NIS, and defense, or cyber defense in this case. Within the law enforcement field, we have the Directive on Attacks Against Information Systems of 2013. Within network and information security, we have the aforementioned NIS Directive, Network and Information Security Directive of 2016, the Cybersecurity Act, which was adopted last year. Currently, there's I believe it's at trilogue stage. Their negotiations for the regulation establishing the cybersecurity competence sector and network, and I believe it's stuck in council now. So we'll have to wait a bit of time to see this particular piece of legislation on actually being published. A brief note on the NIS directive, it's actually being reviewed as we speak. The open public consultation for the review directive closed, I believe, a month ago, and on the 14th of December, or mid-December, somewhere there, Commissioner Vestager and Bresson are scheduled to brief the public on the outcome of this public consultation and of the new version of the NIS directive. The third pillar, defense, or cyber defense. Here we have the cyber diplomacy toolbox, which was adopted in 2017. And I'm going to talk specifically in this presentation. I'm going to talk about the NIS directive and the cyber diplomacy toolbox, because they are the legal measures applicable to the case studies I have chosen today. And we can talk about the cyber diplomacy toolbox in the Q&A sessions a bit after my presentation, because there are probably some of you who would have heard that it was used for the first time in July 2020. But if you're interested, we can talk about this later. Right, so what happened? Well, you know what happened. So COVID happened and the world went digital. This month, raise in attacks against the critical infrastructure sector, the health sector, which is a critical infrastructure sector in the NIS directive, and we've observed this in across various member states, among which Italy, France, a former member state, the UK, and the Czech Republic. And I have chosen the Czech Republic case as my case study today because it represents, it's a really good case study, it's a really good example of the of how the legal framework applies and what the shortcomings of this legal framework are. So what happened basically in March 2020, Brno's hospital suffered a major cyber attack. Now, Brno is the second largest city of the Czech Republic after Prague, after the capital. Its largest hospital suffered a major cyber attack. This is important, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. Afterwards, in April 2020, another series of attacks targeted the Czech Republic's health sector. They were unsuccessful. It was suggested, it was claimed that it might have been state-sponsored and Russia might have been behind the attacks. Czech officials never officially attributed the attack. They never officially said anything like Russia was behind it. But media speculation led to this conclusion. Obviously, Russia denied it. They say this is fake news. So, which legal instruments applies to these two cases? As I mentioned before, these would be the NIS directive and the cyber diplomacy toolbox. And why is this? Because, as I said, the health sector is one of the critical infrastructure sectors identified in the NIS directive. However, bear in mind that does not mean that well, let me retract a bit. So the NIS directive sets security requirements for the so-called operators of essential services within all of these critical infrastructure sectors. Now, these operators of essential services are entities, organizations, businesses, they might be public or private bodies. They need to meet a certain criteria in order to qualify as operators of essential service. So there, let me read this from the NIS directive because I need to give you the proper information here. So in order to qualify as an operator of essential service, these entities need to provide services essential for the maintenance of critical economic activities. Their service needs to depend on network and information systems, and an incident would have a significant disruptive effect on the provision of that service. This is Article 5.2 from the NIS directive, which basically means that not all within the health sector, for example, because we're talking about the health sector, and this means that not all hospitals, medical centers, clinics, surgeries, all medical related entities, not all of them qualify as operators of essential services. So not all hospitals would be an operator of essential service. However, we can only assume that the largest hospital in the second largest city in the Czech Republic was identified as an operator of essential service because it actually meets the given criteria. Obviously, member states haven't disclosed the information which entities, organizations are operators of essential services. This is classified information, obviously, because revealing which are the ones that are cyber secure by law and which are the ones that are not cyber secure by law would create big problems. But we can assume that, as I said, that Brno Hospital was identified by the Czech authorities as operators of essential service. So basically, this major attack targeted an operator of essential service. Now, again, under the NIS directive, we have security requirements such as risk management and preventive measures. These operators of essential services had to implement, which basically means that these particular operators of essential service and the Czech officials, I suppose, sort of failed with the implementation, with the actual enforcement with the NIS directive, because the hospital suffered a major attack, which led to, first of all, it was one of the hospitals performing research on COVID-19. Second of all, the attack was so it was so big that the IT systems had to completely stop working. Acute patients had to be transferred to different hospitals. Ambulances had to be rerouted to different hospitals. No surgeries could have been performed. So basically, for a number of hours, even more than 24 hours, the Britain's hospital was completely unable to perform its duties. So this is what happened in March 2020. As I said afterwards, in April 2020, a new series of attacks followed. And as I said, it was speculated that it was Russia behind them. While we don't know whether this is true or not, but let's say, for the sake of research, let's just assume it was state-sponsored. Let's not point fingers. We're not saying who's performing, who didn't, but for the sake of research, let's just say that it was state-sponsored. And this means that a state performed a wrongful act under international law. And the diplomacy toolbox actually states the EU has endorsed the 2015 United Nations General Assembly conclusions that states need to refrain from operations against each other and from wrongfully using IT systems to target each other. So basically, they've endorsed the United Nations idea of state responsibility in cyberspace. So what happened after these attacks against the Czech Republic? What was the EU's response? As we've seen, an operator's financial services was targeted. Supposedly, there was a state-sponsor attack against one of the member states. So what was the EU's response? On the 30th of April, the High Representative Borrell, he issued a statement. Basically, the statement said the EU and its member states condemn all sorts of malicious activities against the health sector, against the hospitals performing research, etc., etc. But there was no explicit mention of the Czech attack. 2 months later, in June, during the EU-China summit, Ursula von der Leyen seemingly accused China of performing cyber attacks against hospitals on EU territory, and it was cited that she said this cannot be tolerated. Again, no mention of the cyber attacks against the Czech Republic. What was the US response, however? Because there was a US response, Secretary of State Pompeo, he explicitly mentioned the case and referenced the case in a speech on the 18th of April. And he stated that anybody engaging in malicious activity against allies, excuse me, such as what happened in the Czech Republic, anybody engaging in such activity should expect consequences. What does that mean? Basically, we have the EU, which stayed completely silent with regards to what happened in the Czech Republic, but the United States was there protecting its allies. What can that tell you? What can that tell us? And I'm going to conclude with this final slide out my key takeaways and lessons learned, and then I'm going to open the floor for Q&A, and I hope I haven't exceeded my time. I don't think so. Basically, we've seen that the crisis evidenced the shortcomings of the EU approach to cybersecurity because norms are there, they exist, but enforcement is key. You can't, I mean, the fact that it exists on paper does not really mean anything. And since we talk about cybersecurity, and since we talk about critical infrastructure sectors, enforcement needs to be, it needs to happen. There should be no excuses. There are certain excuse me, certain security requirements that needs to be met and need to be implemented. Then the EU needs to be more assertive when member states are attacking cyberspace. And why is that? Because if the EU wants to be a leader in cyberspace, if it wants to have its voice heard, if it wants to promote regulation of cyberspace and responsible state behavior, such as what we said with the diplomacy toolbox, it needs to lead by example. It can't stay silent when something like this happens during pandemic. And I'm going to close here. I hope I was clear enough. And thank you so much for everybody who bore with me and with my many computer issues today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Eva. So I would suggest that also people who have questions, you can already start collecting them in the Discussant chat, so that we can do a brief discussion afterwards when we finish with all the presentations. I think it's the easiest way, and the presenters could also have a look at the questions before. So you can just post your questions to the chat so that they can respond to the questions afterwards. But for now, we will continue with the next presentation by Hongbo. It's a talk about Chinese tourism and Trentino.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'll share my screen to start my presentation. So, okay. A few words about myself. I'm currently a doctoral student at the School of Hotel and Tourism Management at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And previously, I did my master's degree in European Studies at the University of Trentino. And then I worked in the tourism sectors for 7 years. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to present my project. And thanks for the availability of Professor Rech to discuss my paper. And I'll firstly...
I'm sorry for interrupting you. There is some problem, I guess, with the sharing because it's a little bit skewed to the side, the presentation. Maybe
can you hear me now?
Case. We can hear you, but your presentation is not showing the full screen. At least in my case, maybe it's just my problem.
No, it's also my case, yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so it's kind of moved to the right, to the left of the screen. So we see only part of your presentation. Maybe you can just make it full screen so that we see it.
Can you see now?
Maybe you can drag the window a bit left, no, so right.
Or just move your window a little bit to the left, to the right, or to the left. Yes, now we can see the whole presentation. So it's good. You can also, if you want, you can also do a full screen.
I can leave it like this.
Yeah, you can also leave it like this. We can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, like Eva's. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll introduce firstly the topic. So the background of the study is EU-China tourism, and then move to the case study, then promoting Trentino as a new destination of the Chinese outbound tourism market. And then I'll present the research methods, results, and practical implication for the tourism industry and the tourism government part. Okay, as we can see that the Chinese tourism is increasingly attracting attention in the world scene. And in the past decade, it increased significantly as one of the largest tourism markets in the world. And this is very significant also for the destinations to promote itself in as to receive the Chinese tourists. We can see that in 2018, more than 150 million outbound journeys made by Chinese citizens abroad. And this continued also in 2019 and stopped in 2020 for the obvious reason of the pandemic. And the Chinese tourists are not only traveling around the world with big numbers, but they are also spending a lot. As you can see in the statistics, China is ranked among the first expenditure market of the world, followed by United States and Germany. And more than 250 billion US dollars were spent by Chinese tourists in the outbound tourism market in 2019. And most of the Chinese tourists come from the developed regions, so the first and second tier cities of the mainland China. In the European context, the majority of Chinese tourists travel by groups, so they participate in multi-country country tours to see the major cities in Europe to have an idea of how Europe looks like. So this journey might be composed of between 10 to 15 days. And so inevitably, they can see only no more than 5 localities in Italy. So like Rome, Venice, Florence, Milan. For some tailor-made tours or independent travelers, they might go more minor destinations for in-depth itineraries such as Cinque Terre, Sicily, or Capri, Amalfi. So in this itinerary, all the travel products proposed in the Chinese tourism market, there are a lot of lesser known destinations in Europe are still missing. So that's why I got this idea to promote where I was a resident, so in the Trentino, to get more attention to connect the Chinese tourism market to the Italian Alps region. So I did this research using both quantitative and qualitative methods. And I did a questionnaire online with 32 questions and distributed through the network of Chinese students and immigrants living in Italy. And I got 400 respondents valid and did crossover analysis and content analysis to understand their travel preferences, perceptions on Trentino, and their expectations of the travel products and services. And in the qualitative part, I did, based on the constructivist grounded theory approach, I did 15 semi-structured interviews with travel industry professionals and industry partners across Europe and China, and got their insights about how to promote the lesser known destinations in this surging market. So through the inductive content analysis and the interpretive coding process, I got this word cloud. You can see that the different markets is segmented according to the response. And I highlighted the strengths and opportunities for the Trentino that can attract the tourists and the B2B channel business opportunities. But I also identified some weaknesses of the current offers. So I analyzed why in this itinerary Trentino is still missing. As every day I saw when I was living in Trento, I saw the buses passing from Verona to Innsbruck, but do not stop over in the Trentino Alto Adige region. But occasionally there are some independent travelers go to Val di Funes to take pictures, but they don't actually travel in Trentino. So I wonder why. So I did I analyzed the data. I got the data from the Trentino Local Tourism Board and found that in 2008, there were only around 2,000 Chinese tourists visited Trentino, whereas in recent years, there are more than 10,000. But interestingly, before they stayed longer for 4 nights or 5 nights, but recently they stay only 2 to 3 nights. in Trentino. So more tourists coming, but they stay less. Here are some evidence of my qualitative research part. I did participate in EU China Tourism Year events and collected useful information from the industry and also the Global Tourism Economy Forum in Macau, and participated UNWTO initiatives and promoted also this destination in collaboration with the Italian consulate in China, and also did interviews with industry partners from different perspectives across China and Europe. So I got this results that, considering current pandemic, I slightly updated these recommendations I made for the local tourism board and the business stakeholders. So we are facing the unprecedented challenge due to this pandemic. We really need some realistic solutions to guarantee the safety and the health of the tourists when they are traveling internationally. This is not currently happening, but we need to think forward to redesign the local system for the new normality. So the Chinese tourists will pay more attention to the security, health, and the well-being situation when they make the choice of destinations. So it will be important to continue this investment through the B2B and B2C channels, through the marketing campaigns, and focus on those specific Chinese social media promotions, and link the industry and the policy makers together to create this synergy of a public-private partnership. I also find that iconic location and authentic experience of culture, nature, and shopping can be integrated into the product innovation through outbound and inbound to operator collaboration. These are some examples of the tours I organized during my research period. I tried to invite the Chinese professors, journalists, and the students to visit Trentino. So they did a helicopter tour over the city of Trento, had a dining experience at the Forced restaurant, hiking on the Dolomites, and wine tasting at an authentic winery of Rotary. And I got a very positive feedback. And tourism policy also counts in this promotion process. As we can see here, I invited the government of Kunming to visit Trentino to learn how Trentino protects the culture and natural heritage, and try to build the policy foundations for tourism development between these two provinces to facilitate the business and tourist flow. And also for sports tourism, there are the Beijing Winter Olympic Committee visited Trentino to learn how to organize, how to prepare for the sport event. One more aspect should be noticed that there are a lot of Chinese tourists who are also living or studying, working in Europe. So I checked the statistics, at least 2 million of them are living in Europe. So although the pandemic do not allow the Chinese mainland residents to travel to Europe, but the Chinese residents in Europe, they can travel in the EU. So they could also be a target. And the last one is a music tour. Before the pandemic, it's a conservatory of Wuhan visited as a conservatory of Trento and hold a concert as a culture exchange. So the tourists does not only mean the mass tourism, tailor-made tourism, but also means the twin city relationships and more segmented social groups, such as themed tours for music, art, architecture, sport, etc. Inevitably, due to the pandemic, although we proposed some itineraries, travel products to be promoted as in the market, but they currently cannot be implemented. So here are some examples of the summer and winter itineraries I proposed for the post-pandemic recovery process, if we can continue this project. As a limitation of the study, I would say that the future is uncertain. So it's much more, it depends on the vaccine. So now it's a crisis, but also an opportunity to rethink the local system, to think about more sustainable goals in the tourism development from both the Chinese and European side. So the destinations might consider not only the number-centric paradigm, but also to add more values to the local system, and the local stakeholders can also pay more attention to the satisfaction, the well-being of their guests. Lastly, I would like to thank Calito Foundation, the Martino Martini Center, for their support of this project. And thank you for having me at this seminar. And I look forward to your comments and questions. If you want to keep in touch with me, you can scan this barcode to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you, Hongbo, for your presentation. It's indeed a timely discussion about the tourism in the days when we all sit at home. So let's continue with the last presentation from Zane and Šime about Europe-Asia sustainable connectivity in the age of Flux. Let's hope that everything works properly.
Thank you. So, yes, my topic today is Europe-Asia sustainable connectivity. And I think the previous presentation set some basic scene quite well. So I'm very happy for such a sequence of presentations. Thank you so much to the organizers for that. But I will take a look a bit broader. So the aim of my presentation and the paper that is in the background of this presentation is to argue how the joint communication of the EU of the building blocks of the strategy of EU connectivity strategy towards Asia could benefit from mission-oriented innovation and smart specialization. Briefly, the theoretical logic of network institutionalism is the point of departure. So the point of departure overall is the family of the new institutionalism. Then I want to bring more networks into the discussion. So that's what I do with my focus on smart specialization and mission-oriented innovation. And I think there's room for more network-based research and development contexts to put the goals of the joint communication of the European Union of these building blocks of the EU strategy, connectivity strategy towards Asia that was adopted in March 2018 into motion and further enhance the strategic approach overall embodied by this document. Since the discussant briefly touched upon in his email about the methodology, I should also clarify that right away, that my approach is based on a rapid literature review. So basically, I've looked at some of the literature that covers connectivity and links it with other concepts, starting from the year when the joint communication was launched, 2018, roughly. Of course, I mean, if there's something published in 2017, I wouldn't exclude it completely. and my focus is on connectivity, and especially if it's linked to this specific joint communication. So my search was performed via several academic databases, and a sample of grey literature is included in the review as well, namely working papers, policy briefs, as well as policy documents. Of course, the communication itself, but some other additional elements included. Another thing is that I've put also a focus on the EU institutions and EU invited research voices who have expressed rather recently on the overall topic of EU connectivity towards Asia. So that's the overall body of sources that feeds into my overall argument that I would present in the subsequent slides. So when I talk about certain research voices, I would basically point out two key events. That would be Asia-Europe Sustainable Connectivity Scientific Conference, ESSCA, that was held this September, and then a workshop of the EU strategy for the Baltic Sea region. That was basically covering sustainable bioeconomy, but within an overall larger framework of sustainable smart specialization strategies. So the next generation of smart specialization that is known by the abbreviation S4. So the previous smart specialization strategies were S3. Now we're in the S4 phase. That was also briefly discussed in one of the workshops that is affiliated with this year's Smarter conference. If you're interested in smart specialization, Smarter conference as an annual gathering is a go-to event. There'll be several workshops taking place also during the upcoming months. So I invite you to pay attention to that, and the registration details are available online. Why particularly EU strategy for the Baltic Sea region? For those of you who have actually perhaps familiarized with the joint communication of the building blocks of the EU connectivity strategy towards Asia, might have spotted that Baltic Sea region is pointed out as an inspirational region to think about how to enhance connectivity of EU with Asia. So that's why I'm also particularly paying attention what kind of discussions are taking place in this forward-looking and quite pioneering region, because it has certain implications as it's based in the joint communication, but also it might have certain implications in the future on how connectivity is seen and implemented also vis-a-vis other parts of the world, not just within the vicinity of EU. So what I've seen throughout my brief literature review on connectivity is that it comes along with several concepts. So one of them is weaponized interdependence, which is tied to a growing body of literature. And if we look at back at the previous presentation, I should also point out that the Chinese outbound tourism has also been studied through the lens of weaponized interdependence. Then some other key topics, strategic autonomy. That is also linked not only to scholarly concepts, but also to policy debates and policy terms. Some of them, so the typologies that I would like to point out is, so the initial point of departure policy-wise within the EU was strategic autonomy as a concept tied to the defense sector. However, over the last months, few years, the term has traveled. So it has traveled to the trade policy, where it's known now as by the a bit wider understanding of open strategic autonomy. Perhaps some of you who are interested in trade are aware of the ongoing public consultation on the future of the European industrial strategy. Then in the defense sector, again, from the scholarly side, it's tied to such a term as variable autonomy. So for those of you who are fluent in Swedish, I would suggest, if you're interested in the term, to familiarize with the article written by Björn Fagersten and Kalle Håkansson on the matter. It's quite an interesting read. And last but not least, various types of power. Hard power, soft power, smart power, sharp power, power with. All of these are as well. So, and why I'm pointing out these terms is those are the terms that are featuring not only purely academic analysis related to connectivity, but as well as in certain analytical documents produced, for example, by the European Union institutions. Let's say some of the things that I've reviewed is the productions of the European Parliament think tank. Then, how to address interdependencies. When I said earlier that I want to bring more networks in, this is where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the innovation policy side, where mission-oriented innovation is taking the headlines, and taking headlines not only within EU. Mission-oriented innovation has traveled far and wide. It's known and gained many much of interest, for example, in Latin America, as well as in other parts of the world. And smart specialization, which is a more established policy tool that has been already implemented by EU for several years, also has the advantage of being not only well known and implemented within EU, but also promoted worldwide with already certain lessons learned. So what is interesting also about this joint communication and overall understanding how the overall discourse revolves around EU connectivity towards Asia is that it relates to, for example, existing strategic frameworks, such as EU Central Asia Strategy. But what I would like to suggest for further consideration, for example, for the revised or updated version of the EU strategy, connectivity strategy towards Asia, would be also to, of course, incorporate some of the major strategic frameworks that have been adopted quite recently. And one of such examples that I'm presenting is, pointing out is the EU-India Strategic Partnership, a roadmap to 2025. So I am treating, in my analysis, this framework as a potentially a document for further revision, not as a living document. So my final remarks, why I wanted to point out several of the concepts that I've identified in the literature is that concepts set a tone. So it is not only for the policymakers to create a certain tone and sentiment around certain terms. I invite you, those who are familiar with the sociology of sociology and self-reflexivity, that is quite an interesting term and widely used among practice term researchers, to look at yourselves also as the agents of certain sentiment and a certain tone that is being promoted around certain topics. And I think two of the presentations that we heard earlier were excellent examples in that respect. And then, of course, what is interesting about the study of connectivity, not only at the moment, but also in the future, is that there are many prominent connectors. EU is just one of them. So that means that the connectivity and its understanding will evolve over time. And I would see that there is, for the research community also, an opportunity to shape the way it's being promoted. And this is where I'm coming with my suggestion for further consideration, is that since the joint communication itself puts such an important emphasis on trade, on business cooperation, on research cooperation as well, then smart specialization and missions that have such a prominent role right now and are also known in various parts of the world should come in as good components in the future framework of EU connectivity towards Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zane, for your presentation, and thanks to all the presenters. We now continue with the discussion of the presentations. So we start first with Helena, who will comment on Eva's presentation, and then we will continue with Maximillian.
So I'd like to thank very much, obviously, UACES for giving me the opportunity to actually serve as discussant. It's always a very big pleasure to actually contribute to any UACES activities. And also, obviously, I'd like to thank Eva also for sending me a two-page paper in advance, which I, kind of mapped out very nicely what she wanted to do. This is also an area I think the first time I met Eva was already a couple of years ago, maybe at the start of her PhD. And so it's really nice to see the progression in the PhD in terms of direction, in terms of, the whole package kind of coming together. So it's really, really great to actually be able to observe this evolution. So this specific presentation was about the legal framework that actually applies to the current cyber attacks, and the fact, and it was a wider reflection on whether EU cybersecurity policy is actually fit for purpose, really. So I think that it was a very nicely put together presentation that actually really highlighted the current framework, actually used a specific case study of the Brno incident, and then actually reflected on whether, what does it say really about the current legislation. So I think that's really great. I do, in terms of my comments, I think in fact, I ended up structuring my comments rather than comments. I actually ended up putting together a bunch of questions. So if you don't mind, I do have about 7 questions for you. So feel free to just pick and mix, not answer everything, just, within the time frame you have. So my first question, I've got some questions which are specifically about the presentation, and others which are more to push you towards actually reflecting about what does this say about the wider cybersecurity policy, or even about what does it say about the EU as a security actor. So the first one is, so I noticed that you assumed in your presentation that because there was a cyber attack that targeted Brno Hospital, that this specific operator of essential services, which I agree with you is probably an operator of essential services, is not complying with the NIS directive. But I don't really understand why you'd be assuming this. What do you base yourself on, basically? So what evidence do you base yourself on to say that, well, just because they were targeted, that means that actually they weren't complying with the NIS directive? There's lots of cyber attacks every day, essentially. Not everyone who is targeted is not complying with the NIS directive. And I can actually choose an example very close to home, which is actually both of our universities, Northumbria and Newcastle, were recently targeted by massive cyber incidents that lasted for about two months, that crashed our entire systems. That doesn't mean that we're not complying with the NIS directive. So that was my first question. The second question is that goes more in the direction of, I admittedly, my area of research, which is what challenges do you identify from the fact that actually most of the operators of essential services, so this is thinking actually beyond the health sector, but also about the health sector as well, are actually mainly private. So what are the consequences of the fact that you're trying to regulate an entire area where a lot of the operators are actually not public, they're private? What do you think that, well, given the origin and the nature of most cyber attacks nowadays, Do you think that actually, I know you already referred to this in your presentation, but do you think that EU legislation is actually fit for purpose, given that, you know, you are actually saying what kind of legislation applies to this cyber attacks? My question is, does it really apply? I mean, is it really useful, the way it's been developed? And then once, you know, on the basis of how you describe the EU's response, what do you think this says about the EU as a cybersecurity actor in general? So thinking about the other two pillars, what kind of actor does this really make the EU? And then in terms of the US response, I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned as well the US response. You know, you compared it to the EU. You know, the EU not really being, you know, a particular, you know, strong response. This is actually a nice way of putting it. So, I mean, I thought it was interesting that actually you mentioned that the US said, well, there will be consequences because we protect our allies. But is this actually an empty narrative? What actions has the US actually taken that suggest that their response has actually been stronger in this area? I'm almost finished, I promise. In terms of, and I'm thinking in terms of European integration trends, COVID-19 is obviously considered as a crisis, and you do present it as such. How would you evaluate its impact on the EU cybersecurity policy, not just the legislation, but in general, the policy? In particular, like, who has this been a crisis for in terms of EU actors? And has anyone actually benefited from it? What do I mean by this in practice? So a lot of EU policies and a lot of EU integration processes actually get accelerated by crisis, by political crisis. So do you think that actually COVID-19 is going to do that for cybersecurity? And then finally, what ideational and legal trends do you identify in EU cybersecurity that have been interrupted or maybe further reinforced by COVID-19? So these two questions are basically related. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to provide comments and questions, well, mostly questions, and I'm looking forward to the answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. So I think we first also would listen to Maximilian's feedback to our presentations. In the meanwhile, Eva, you could also think about the answers. And I would like to remind you as well to use the chat function so that you post the questions. There is already one question for Eva, but if you have questions to the other presenters, please use the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Zhang Hongbo. Thank you, Zane, Šime, for your papers. I have the beautiful task to be a discussant or act as a discussant for two papers, so bear with me. In addition, the two papers have one thing in common. They basically very much in tourism and marketing. The other one is very much in, well, sustainability, literature, or if we would like to put it a little bit more in the strategic competition literature. And so in that sense, I'll try to do my very best to give both of you feedback on your wonderful discussions and the presentations that you've given. Let's start with Zhang Hongbo. Zhang Hongbo, I think that the underlying theoretical framework that you're looking at is destination marketing. You have mentioned it yourself, and in that sense, I think that we can compare it to a certain extent with what we would see the other way around with regards to trade in goods as country of origin marketing. And so in that sense, I think that if you look at the literature of country of origin marketing and destination marketing, you could potentially learn something between the overlapping conceptual understandings of both theoretical tenets when looking at destination marketing for, let's say, tier 2, tier 3, even city in Italy, which Trentino is. I thought that methodologically speaking, you have a very sound and solid research framework which has both the qualitative insight from your own work. You said that you worked for 7 years in this sector and you've conducted 15 exploratory interviews with industry experts in the area. And so in that sense, I would very much like to see maybe in your next presentation some of the key tenets that you have coded from those exploratory interviews with the industry experts, which kind of like run like a red thread through the 15 interviews. That would be quite interesting. And this is the qualitative part. And then the quantitative part, I mean, having 32 questions, probably all in Chinese, to Chinese students in Europe, Chinese travelers in Europe, and other Chinese people that are potentially interested in traveling to Italy, with a sample size of 402 is substantial for such a report. I think that's very good. And I think that there's a lot more content in those 402 answers, or compounded by 32 questions, right, than the word cloud that you have provided us with. So in that sense, maybe you could try to draw our attention to 1 or 2 key statistics, maybe 3 key points, key takeaways from the quantitative insights. I feel that the word cloud is good, but the most important term in your word cloud is Chinese, followed by tourism, for example. I think that there's a lot more content in your interviews or in the quantitative survey than what you have presented us with. And I think this could emphasize and improve your paper, to be honest. Afterwards, you say, and at one point, that the product innovation is key. And I think there you speak a little bit from your personal experience as an expert in that field, saying that you need to combine culture with nature and shopping. And here, I think you understand the Chinese tourists very well. And in that sense, I full-heartedly agree with you. The question that you have to ask yourself, or maybe that the people in Trentino, and by extension from that case study, other third-tier tourist destinations all across Europe or the world have to ask themselves is, how can we attract and appeal to Chinese tourists? And here I would like to take one step back and understand Chinese tourists once more. You had one infographic in your presentation portraying Xi Jinping and a couple of images on Italy. And you were talking about the group tourists, right? But later on in the presentation, you actually talk about the individual traveler. And this is exactly what I'm after. You have to first and foremost give us a sort of typology of what is the Chinese tourist, who are Chinese tourists in general, and what specific typology of Chinese tourists do I look at, or should Trentino look at, or should third-tier destinations look at? And here, of course, there has been a lot that has been written about that. We have done ourselves some research on wowing the Chinese tourists when coming to Europe. So you could argue that there is the aspirationals, the rising middle class, the new money tourists, basically the two house, right? The independents and the established. So this is a five-type or five-fold typology that Sophie Villemé from the, let's say, more consultancy background gave. You can also have a look at the McKinsey report. They have written 3 reports, one in 2018 and 2 more in May 2020 and in October 2020, which gave a specific typologies of 8 different Chinese travelers. And I think at that moment in time, we can kind of overcome the idea that Trentino and similar cities want to appeal to group tourists. This is not what Trentino is after and should be after, frankly. But instead, focus on the independence that you have mentioned yourself, and maybe the also, kind of like out of the ordinary traveler that would stay a little bit longer and carry with them a lot of money. Speaking of money, you have given us a little bit of an overview of Chinese travelers and Chinese tourists abroad. You have given us the overall number of Chinese tourists and what they spend. Instead, have a look at per capita spending of Chinese tourists. I know that those numbers are relatively difficult to get, but if you look at per capita spending, you will see that the Chinese tourists are actually spending even more than what your statistics showed us. Because if you give us overall numbers for the compounded population of China with 1.4 billion people, it's always going to be first, but it doesn't tell the real story. So in that sense, go one step deeper and tell us how much they spend actually per capita. And then you'll see what they spend money on, which is exceptional experiences, as well as shopping, as you rightly pointed out, namely shopping of luxury goods, particularly in Italy, particularly in France and other nations in Europe, where the cost of those luxury goods is actually cheaper than back home in Shanghai, where I live. So in that sense, this is something which is important and should be looked at in detail. I have another colleague of mine whom you could talk to, Rachel Feng, Dr. Rachel Feng, or Feng Xiang. She's with Shanghai Normal University, and she's been doing tourism and destination marketing for the city of Hangzhou, Tiandahu, which is the 1,000 island lake in China, but then also Amsterdam and Rotterdam. And if you look at Amsterdam, it's the tier 1 destination. But if you look at Rotterdam, it's really not, I mean, sorry if we have anyone from Rotterdam here, but it's really not as beautiful a city. So maybe she can give you a little bit of an insight on how to market cities which are not top tier tourist destinations. Happy to put you in touch. Of course, COVID, again, you've given us statistics. There is a very good Chinese outbound tourism report from Statista Online that also shows us the impact of COVID. And of course, the Chinese travelers will not be able to travel abroad for the time being. And most of them, even if they had the chance to go and travel abroad, they don't want to. So I'm talking 87% of the Chinese tourists don't want to, okay? So this is huge, of course, almost 90%. That said, 10% of the Chinese tourists is still enough to fill the city of Trentino 365 days a year. So in that sense, I think that despite it being a niche market in China, it's large enough a market for a small city like Trentino. And I will finish on one important aspect that I had, which is a little bit of recommendations. You told us that Italians should focus on social media, but I would want you to be bringing your insight, your expertise to the table. Think about what the Italians in Trentino really need to understand. You know that, but an average Italian doesn't know that. What am I talking about? You need to decline down the social media in China. If you just tell me go on social media in China, then the people will end up on Weibo and they will invest time and effort and money, and it will not lead anywhere. So what you need to do is to emphasize what exactly needs to be done by each restaurant owner, by each hotel owner, namely to make sure that next to TripAdvisor, and maybe Instagram, they need to start focusing on social media such as Meituan and Dianping, or such as Xiaohongshu, which is the equivalent of Instagram in China, or such as Tudou, Kuaishou, Douyin, which is like TikTok, right? So in that sense, kind of choose one or two of those social media and then focus your attention on them. In addition, of course, most of the Chinese still book via online travel agencies. And this has become a trend, especially with the younger travelers, which also tend to be the more independent travelers, right? So go for targeted advertisements on Ctrip, for example, and also focus on Tuna and Fliggy and try to tell stories through those online travel agencies, which then allow the Chinese to discover the city of Trentino from afar. So this would be quite key. And I think this is a key recommendation which you have to give to the local partners that you're working with. Finally, of course, reductions. I mean, it's the 12th of November. We had Singles Day yesterday, 11th of November, the world's largest e-commerce sales day. We have e-commerce sales day throughout the year in China, whether it's Ba or 11/11, so 8/8 or 11/11, or I don't know, 5/20, which is Chinese Valentine's Day. You need to tell the Italian partners that you're working with that they need to have a year-long calendar with specific reductions and percentage reductions of prices, which they can then advertise on to the Chinese consumer directly. And I think this is key when you want to understand what targets to fulfill and what KPIs to use in order to fulfill those targets. So you mentioned, for example, increase the stay length could be one target or one KPI to achieve the target, because the number of independent travelers is going down and the time they spent in Trentino is going down. But maybe that's not a bad thing. You need to have, you need to look into that and say, they stay shorter periods of time, but spend more money, for example, and then it would not necessarily be a problem, right? So try to figure that out. And then one last element, it's another concept which you could look into. That's the Net Promoter Score. The Net Promoter Score is kind of like, it's a little bit like the TripAdvisor score, right? Like how can you have KOLs, like key opinion leaders, or KOCs, key opinion consumers, namely influencers from China, to talk positively about Trentino after their stay, during or after their stay, right? And this would increase the visibility of such a tier 2, 3 city among the Chinese target audience that you have. Now, I have a question for you. Why PPP? Why public-private partnership? I feel this is a very Chinese approach. In tourism in Europe, I don't think it works just that way. We have, of course, tourism agencies that actually kind of combine the state of Italy with specific tourist destinations. But beyond that, I don't think that there is a necessity for public-private partnership if you want to attract more Chinese tourists to Trentino. So maybe you could explain to us why you would suggest that PPP for the city of Trentino. Okay, thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time. Olga, I continue with Zane, Šime, yeah?
Yeah, just try to keep it short. Maybe you can forward the comments afterwards as well, so that the participants could have a chance to reply briefly to the comments. Sure. There are some questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. Thank you, Zane, for your presentation. I think that the sustainability paradigm is very interesting. I think that I have put that to you in the email already. The question that you have to ask yourself potentially is, how can we have a constructive angle to that? To me, sustainability and cooperation between Europe and Asia is something which is positive. But then you come in and you give us 5 concepts, the first 3 of which are very much in the geopolitical sphere, very much in the political sphere, which is becoming increasingly competitive, I have the feeling. I am reminded, obviously, of the EU strategic outlook, which you do not mention, which is the cooperation partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival, which was also announced 2 years ago. And when I looked at weaponized interdependence, strategic autonomy, and various types of power, I fear that this is very much a confrontational approach rather than constructive or cooperative approach, which is my very first feeling when I saw your paper or the presentation. And so in that sense, I'm wondering, what exactly would you want to achieve? Do you want to have the mission-oriented innovation systems as something where you try to see a specific comparative advantage of a specific city, like the city of Riga, or a region such as the region, which can add value in EU-Asia cooperation? Or do you see it as a sort of competition for predominance? And I think this needs to be understood, because when I listen to your presentation, it feels very much like it's either or. And here you could, of course, argue power is key. Robert Dahl gives the definition: A has power over B to the extent that it can get B to do what B would otherwise not do. And this is a little bit how I feel your presentation comes about. It's choose between Europe and China, or choose between those connectors that you have mentioned: China, Russia, US, Europe, right? But maybe there is possibility for a side-by-side, like a cohabitation, as we say in French, a coexistence in English, of various forms of connectivity. One from China, the Belt and Road Initiative, obviously, and then the EU-Asia connectivity strategy, which can come in and maybe give a slightly different approach to the very same problematic that those nations in question, the Eurasian landmass, is facing. And so in that sense, that would be my question to you. How can this smart specialization help add value rather than emphasize the competition between Europe and China? or Europe and other connectors in this region. And one last thing, power, I mean, it's also to a certain extent attention, right? Everybody has criticized the European Union for having this EU-Asia connectivity strategy, which is a very complicated title, a joint communique, etc., etc. And everybody knows the Belt and Road Initiative. So what did Europe do wrong? Why does it feel so much less appealing? Why does it not capture the attention of India, of Tajikistan, of Iran, and of other nations in Eurasia that should potentially be willing to cooperate with China, with Europe. One last element on standards. I think standards are potentially very important for what you are doing. I feel that China is trying to set standards in international organizations. And here this competition versus cooperation comes in again. If we decide as Europeans and the West, speaking of strategic autonomy, not to engage with China, aka not to be within their institutions, then we have no longer a possibility to influence the standards that they will use to do business in Eurasia. Whereas the AIIB approach, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, was an attempt of the UK, Germany, France, etc., to join the AIIB and thereby influence the standards from within the institution, which comes a little bit back to your network institution approach that you give us in the beginning. So again, kind of the question, what should we go for? Competition maybe, or rather cooperation, which would also ultimately allow us to have a greater say within the cooperation that we have. I have a little bit of literature which I can share with you in an email. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments. I think we had lots of interesting inputs for the further research for all the presenters. Since we had some technical issues, if you want to stay 5 to 10 minutes longer, I think we can run the session a little bit longer to give everybody an opportunity to respond or ask the questions. So if it's okay with the presenters, I know for some of you it's quite late in the night. So maybe we could just suggest that we start with Hongbo so that you can go to bed earlier, and then continue with Eva and Zane if it's okay with you. Okay, so let's start with Hongbo. If you would like to respond, I don't see any questions to you in the chat. So if you would like to respond to the comments, you can do it now. You have maybe 2 to 5 minutes for this. If anything, I will message you.
Thank you very much for your conducive comments and very useful and insightful inputs about the Chinese context. You addressed many missing informations I didn't mention in my presentation. And about the question, I go directly. So about PPP, I think it's you're right. It's particularly important in the Chinese context because it is very important to create this link of the different types of business actors with the institutions that regulate tourism live in China. So this is very pressing this case because the Chinese business sector often follows the government instructions. And there's also a willingness of the Chinese tourists who follow the government instructions on where to go, where not to go. So, and this means that as a promotional actions that the business stakeholders initiate will be more effective and credible in the eyes of their business partners if it's supported by a concerted institutional action. This has been proved by the twin province test I made between the Kunming and the Trentino, or previously between Sichuan and the Trentino. So more travel agencies of Sichuan pay more attention to their products of Dolomites, Garda Lake than other regions. Okay, and the other issue is competitiveness, because Chinese visit not only one country, they visit different destinations during one tour. So it can be easily skipped or changed the destination. So one issue is the price. Okay, price. If the price is competitive, then the business stakeholders might attract more tourists to that area. The other issue is the friendliness of the people, the local residents, and their political relations with China. So there is also a culture distance, the political culture distance, if it's more close to China, like in the case of Serbia. It's among the most fast increasing destination of Chinese visitors, and it issues also more favorable visa policies, so visa-free between the two countries. So this is also another factor that affects the tourist flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your response, Hongbo, and for your presentation. So I think we can continue now with Eva. You got lots of questions, so maybe you can pick the ones that you would like to respond to. You can always continue the discussions per email with our discussants.
Yes, fantastic. I'll try to be quick because I know Lena's got to go. So thank you so much appreciated. I've always found your feedback very beneficial for my research. So absolutely grateful for all of your questions. I'm going to try to address all of them, and I'll try to be very brief. So let's see how I'll do. So the first question is that what is the reason for me to claim that the Britain Hospital wasn't complying with the NIS directive requirements? Obviously, this is speculative, isn't it? However, I'm claiming this because under the NIS directive, operators of essential services need to have implemented, incorporated certain security requirements, certain risk management measures, certain preventive measures in order to prevent these sorts of attacks. So if it happens, obviously cyber attacks are always going to happen. Obviously, as you've mentioned, Newcastle University, which I suffered from, was targeted by a cyber attack. But obviously that does not mean Newcastle wasn't complying with certain criteria. Same thing goes for all the operators of essential services. I do believe, I should hope, they've implemented what they have been told to do, and certainly cyber attacks are going to happen one day or another. But again, since we're talking about something so critical, I do believe the expectation would be that these attacks are more the exception, not the rule, because we know they happen, but they shouldn't cause major damage. So this is why I claim it, because the framework is there, the law's there, the law says certain criteria needs to have been implemented. So if it happens and if it creates major damage, it leads to the conclusion, or at least makes me think that something down the line didn't go as expected, and it wasn't probably at technical level, it wasn't implemented as it was supposed to be. Second question, challenges for the, because certainly most of the operators of essential services are private bodies and entities and organizations, and it's very challenging to regulate them because it's not public. Again, this is one of the major issues identified in the NIS directive, and this is why the NIS directive talks about public-private partnership. Because we know the authorities don't actually have in their hands these operators of essential services. They've encouraged these private bodies to take the necessary requirements, and this is a challenge. It is. But the NIS directive says that public-private partnership and cooperation needs to be enforced. So let's hope that it's not as big of a challenge as one would expect in the future. A third question is, do you framework fit for purpose? Oh, 2 minutes need to go. Regarding the origins of the cyber attacks. Well, I mean, with any legal framework, I suppose there's always gaps. And this is our job, isn't it, as scholars, to identify what all these gaps are and where things could improve in the future. So I would hope that with the new version of the NIS directive, many of these gaps would be filled, and many of these gaps would be identified. And actually, the review was scheduled for 2021, but the Commission anticipated it, not only because of the crisis, but because they've realised there is this need to review the directive because of the many sort of implementation challenges it created among member states. So I would like to believe that the legal framework is, it might be not fit for purpose now, but hopefully down the line it will be. At least that's the ambition. I'm going to skip one question and then go back to it. The US and the empty narrative. Yeah, I mean, but isn't that what politics is? I mean, a lot of it is. Oh, this is registered, isn't it? Anyway, no, what I meant is that even in its diplomacy toolbox, the EU claims that by putting measures, they're going to, I mean, attackers would be thinking twice before targeting states in the EU. So any measure would be sort of acting as a deterrent. So it might be just empty words what the US response was, but claiming that any perpetrator in cyberspace that is targeting US allies should expect consequences, we could claim this has the same impact, the EU diplomacy toolbox, and its claims that it is going to deter attackers from performing attacks. They might have the same effect because it's putting it out there. Don't do it because you need to expect you should expect consequences. This might be just my opinion. I'm open to comments and yeah, people disagreeing with me on this particular one. So the EU response, what she said about is the security actor. Well, it has a long road to, I mean, how do you say this in English? That we still can't claim the EU is as coherent of a security actor as we would like it to be, or at least as I would like it to say. I do believe in European integration. So I suppose because of its nature, we can't. I mean, it wasn't built. Security wasn't built in the building blocks. Security wasn't one of the building blocks of the EU. So I suppose this is one of the. Not all of the member states would be on the same page when it comes to security and specifically cybersecurity. So, yeah. And the last question, and I missed your very last question, so I'm probably not going to answer this. And this is going to be my final point, and I know you need to go. Again, regarding the integration, yes, I do believe that all threats, and specifically obviously this threat, it has effect on EU policies in general. And I do believe it has a positive effect on the EU policies. I mean, I believe it was yesterday the Commission announced its EU Health Union, and this is all thanks to COVID. And
did realize the fact that in terms of health systems, there was a lot of fragmentation across member states. So yeah, the good side of the pandemic is that the EU addressed the issue of fragmented health system, and we're probably looking at a health union happening in the future. So I'm going to finish now, and I know Helena's got to go. Thank you so much again. And there is another question for me in the chat box. So yeah, bye, Helena. So let me just read it again, and then I'm going to stop talking. Wait. Do you think the EU should center impose sanctions on cyber attacks, or leave it down to individual member states' jurisdiction where the attacks takes place? Right. I do believe the EU needs to act as a coherent and single body when it comes to cyber attacks against its member states. This all comes back to what type of a security actor is the European Union, and is it a security actor? Is it does it manage to have its voice heard in cyberspace? But no, again, we go back to the diplomacy toolbox, because diplomacy toolbox says that while attribution, and this is key, attribution of a cyber attack is up to the member state. So if the Czech Republic wants to claim that X, Y, and Z state attacked it in cyberspace, the Czech the Czech Republic needs to attribute it, and it should not expect the EU to attribute it. This is a completely separate thing. So the diplomacy toolbox, says attribution is a sovereign decision of the member state. That does not mean that without EU attribution, we cannot have EU joint response, which is what was missing in this particular case. Now, having said that, as I mentioned in my presentation, I'm going to conclude with this. At the beginning, I've mentioned that the diplomacy toolbox was used for the first time in July this year, and for the second time in October this year, months ago. And what I mean by this is that in July, the EU issued so-called restrictive measures, which are sanctions in EU language, against 6 individuals and 2 entities. This happened in July. And in October, it issued sanctions again on 2 individuals and 1 entity. Now, the interesting thing here is that in July, they've issued these sanctions against these individuals, which were 2 Chinese citizens and 4 Russian citizens. And it was, I believe, yeah, 2 Chinese and 4 Russians. So what happened is that, if you remember, a few years ago, there was the WannaCry attack, which happened in 2017. And the non-Petya attack, which happened a few months later, again in 2017. So basically, based on these attacks, the EU issued its sanctions in 2020, but it didn't attribute the attacks to WannaCry with Northumbria, and NotPetya was targeting Ukrainian systems, supposedly Russian, but it didn't attribute the attacks to these foreign states. It targeted the actual individuals. And this happened only 3 years later. And the second case, I've mentioned in October last year, not in October this year, in last month I meant, an operation against the Bundestag, the German federal parliament, in 2015. So we're talking about taking measures 5 years after the attack has taken place. So the fact that the European Union did not address these the attacks on the Czech Republic does not mean that probably 5 years from now they're not going to do so. But again, in cyberspace, you need to act that particular moment. I mean, otherwise it's just, I mean, the US issued its warning. the EU, the least it could have done is issue a warning. The same way Ursula von der Leyen said regarding China, that she warned China that these attacks on critical infrastructure sectors, on the health sector, should not be tolerated. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, if you have more questions, you can send me an email. And yes, let me leave the floor to the last speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. So thank you, because we are running a little bit late, but I still would like Zane to have some time to respond to the comments if you want to. And I think there was also a question for you in the chat. So.
Yes, thank you. I'll start with Maximillian's feedback. Thank you so much. Yes, I didn't clarify at the beginning of my presentation, but the reason why I would like to bring in the mission-oriented innovation and smart specialization to the overall discussion, be it policy or be it purely scholarly, is to further enhance the collaborative spirit around the overall concept or term of connectivity. Yes, especially bearing in mind the recent geostrategic sentiment that has been there, and that's why I also pointed out at the very beginning some of these more confrontation, perhaps oriented concepts. Just not to paint a rosy picture that connectivity is only about reaching out to potential enthusiastic collaborators, but overall, I very much would like it to be more on a collaborative side, because these concepts for innovation and research and development bring a win-win sentiment to just about anyone who would like to engage either in it bilaterally or multilaterally. So it would be cooperation over any type of confrontational or competition type of sentiment. One of the things why, to respond to your question, how EU could better articulate why it might be of interest and of benefit for various actors in Asia to cooperate with the EU, I think it lies in the very challenge that EU as a post-Westphalian entity or as a region with very distinct neo-Westphalian traits is trying to actively engage with entities that are very Westphalian oriented and still in that phase of development. So the very governance modes and these networks that are brought into discussion offer a different type of engagement that is not purely intergovernmental bilateral type of mode of cooperation and consultations. I would say in very, very brief terms, that's the biggest challenge so far with certain entities perhaps. And last but not least, what I see a bit of a challenge, but that could be easily resolved, I think, in the future editions of this strategic approach of EU connectivity towards Asia is the current joint communication, section 5.3, says quite clearly, and it embodies this trade-oriented approach of a level playing field for business. It goes into this thinking of state or EU as a market fixer, whereas innovation-driven, this mission-oriented approach, as promoted by Maria Mazzucato, is about state as a shaper of the market, not as a fixer. And here I see also a bit of a challenge perhaps for future engagement. For example, if your counterpart, for example, for the EU entities to cooperate with non-EU entities, if these non-EU entities are based in a country which is just as enthusiastic about Mazzucato's innovations as the EU does, then there is a compatibility of understanding what is the market all about and what is the role of public sector in it. But what do you do with perhaps certain countries in Asia who are still in the market fixer phase, who are not, which are not perfectly enthusiastic about drifting away from this approach, you know, like with all that comes along, what we've seen recently with all the protective measures that have been put in place due to the crisis situation. And briefly upon Carlos' question, thank you so much. I should clarify right away that my approach overall has been very qualitative, but I am aware, yes, that social network analysis, especially in a quantitative center of in-between centrality, might be an interesting thing to do. What I spot right away as an immediate challenge, if I tell you like without extensive research on the topic, is that, for example, so framework programs, the EU framework programs might be the future way forward, how to boost this mission-oriented innovation approach from the EU side. But not all of the EU-funded framework-funded projects might necessarily be very, very purely or distinctively mission-affiliated. But maybe they, you know, deal with other topics. So then it's a bit of a methodological challenge. How do you, for example, screen them through Cordis so that to take out those that are very mission-oriented and those that are not purely mission-oriented? The other thing that I see about the network analysis is, okay, so for EU framework programs, we have this very valuable database, Cordis. For smart specialization, that might be a bit more challenging. The smart specialization platform has different types of databases, but finding a very complete and comprehensive database for these specific needs for Europe and Asia might be a bit of a challenge. To spot all the consortiums and to claim for a certain completeness of the picture generated. But that's my initial assumption. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there is a way how to go about it. But these are my initial things that I could say, bearing in mind my earlier research that I did, for example, for student mobility and what kind of challenges that is encountering in terms of the statistical databases that are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zane, for your answers. I think, yeah, I think we can finish now. Thank you, everybody, for your presentations, for very good comments to all our discussants. Thank you, Maximillian. And if you would like to have further discussion, you can always address your discussants, I guess. And thank you for staying a little bit longer with us. We would be happy to see you in our next events. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.